Gentleman yields back. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2017, the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to have the opportunity to address you here on the floor of the United States House of Representatives and ask the people that are listening to our conversation to weigh heavily some of the remarks that will be made here during this half hour. I come to the floor tonight, Mr. Speaker, to address the situation of innocent, unborn human life in America, and to recount the path that we've followed and to lay out a path for the future that gives us a better opportunity to save as many lives as possible. For me, Mr. Speaker, I recall that when 1973 rolled around, January 22nd of 1973, and on that date, we had two major decisions that came down from the United States Supreme Court. Roe versus Wade, which most everybody knows, and the other one was Doe versus Bolton. And then of those two cases that dropped on us, in January of 1973, not very many people, if any, understood the magnitude of the decisions that had been made that day, or the impact it would have on the population of the United States of America, or did they believe that we would see 45 years of pro-life marchers coming to the city in the middle of the winter and sometimes marching through the snow from down on the mall all the way up to the United States Supreme Court building, calling upon the Supreme Court to correct the decision that was made by an activist court in 1973. But the bottom line of that decision was that an abortion was essentially declared to be, some would say, a constitutional right for any reason or no reason at all, as much as you might want to parse the phrases in Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton, Mr. Speaker. And, of course, and for me, I didn't realize in 1973 the impact of this. But by 1976, when my first son was born, I remember holding him in my hands and looking at David Stephen King, understanding the miracle of life and the miracle of birth, and thinking within that first hour of his life, how could anyone take his life now? This little miracle child with that big old head of dark hair and blue eyes and gurgling a little bit and crying some and squirming a lot, but a miracle. And I thought, how could anyone take his life now when he's an hour old, or a minute old, or a minute before he was born, or an hour before he was born? Could they take his life, or a day, or a week, or a month, or a trimester? When could you decide that this child's life could be ended, and do so within a moral framework rather than a framework of maybe self-interest? And I concluded that there was only one moment, only one instant. We have to choose that moment when life begins. And there is only one, and that's the moment of conception. And we all know that. I knew it in 1976. I'm sure I knew it before then, but I hadn't thought about it very much. And here we are today. We know. We know by the benefit of ultrasound, we're watching little babies squirm around in the womb. We're watching them yawn and stretch and suck their thumb and try to talk and stretch themselves, and they belch, and they do all the things inside the womb that they do pretty shortly after they get outside the womb. That's life. It's miraculous life. Little hands, little feet, little fingers, little toes, little nose, little eyes, little babies that are defenseless. And this Congress has allowed a Supreme Court to impose an abortion on demand in America, and we've worked to put together very few limitations on that abortion on demand. And I don't think we've done enough either to send the message to America that life begins at the moment of conception. But ultrasound has shown many of us in this country, millions of us, that life does exist inside the womb. And we know that we can, even with a transabdominal ultrasound, we can verify a heartbeat in 7 to 8 weeks from conception. 7 to 8 weeks. And that little baby is formed by then with a beating heart. And we know that of those babies that have a detectable beating heart, 95% of those babies will experience a successful birth. At least 95%. Some say more. So if 95% of them or more are destined to experience a successful birth, but yet the most dangerous place for a baby is in that baby's mother's womb. The most dangerous place, because our hearts are hardened by a Supreme Court decision that some think there's no changing, that we have to live with it in perpetuity and accept the consequences of 60 million babies being aborted. There's a hole in the population of America, 60 million babies strong. And some of those little girls that were aborted would be mothers by now. And when you do the math on that, just back of the envelope, that's perhaps as many as another 60 million babies. A missing 120 million Americans that would otherwise have been born in this country and had the opportunity to live, to love, to laugh, to learn, to worship, to be mothers or fathers of their own. That's what we're asking for here in this Congress with 170 co-sponsors on the Heartbeat bill. And one of those co-sponsors is a bit of a rare commodity himself, the gentleman who is the conservative from California, Mr. Doug LaMalfa, to whom I'd be happy to yield as much time as he may consume. Mr. LaMalfa?
Well, thank you. I'm indeed pleased to join my colleague from Iowa, Mr. King, tonight, who's been a very strong, tireless leader on this issue and many other important ones for our Congress, for our country. So thank you for that and for letting me be here and be part of this tonight. So obviously, it's a very important issue that we need to have a much better discussion than we've had in a long time in this country. The moral of the Heartbeat Protection Act is extremely simple to understand. If a physician performs an abortion after detecting a heartbeat, other than to save the life of the mother, it is against the law. Now, Mr. King was speaking about a moment ago. To anybody that uses common sense, life begins at conception. At that moment of conception, you have a life. If you don't have a conception, obviously you don't have a life. So how is it that it is even a debate? How do people hide on the sidelines in the shadows, somehow debating it as something like, well, is it really a life? Or what line do we draw that point at? And that's an important point Mr. King made as well, that is with all the different ideas of when is an abortion appropriate. We have a 20-week mark, we have the end of the first trimester, end of the second trimester. What date is it going to be appropriate? We have people these days talking about partial birth abortion not being a problem at all. And even in some extreme quarters, some people are saying that post-birth is somehow an acceptable way, that it isn't really a person with rights at that point. But we're talking about a much narrower thing here, with the heartbeat being a true detectable moment of life. When prospective mothers go in for those ultrasounds, it's a very moving moment for she and hopefully her mate there with her to see what's going on inside there with all those little baby parts that are being formed and the miracle that life is. But it's really a telling moment when that prospective mother can hear that heartbeat. And that's what's so important in this whole debate about having that tool of an ultrasound to show what is really going on here for those that try to obfuscate what's happening with the pregnancy. And let that prospective mother make an informed decision, not one that's hidden, not one that's obfuscated by, oh, it's just a tissue mass or something. And that's what's the crime about a lot of this, is that a lot of these women are not being allowed to make an informed decision about what is really going on. So this heartbeat bill that Steve is championing here, Mr. King is championing, is an important moment in time for a prospective mom and her mate to be able to have an informed decision and really contemplate this life that is happening and the downside of what that abortion might mean. So indeed, is it not a crime to murder a human being with a heartbeat? It really shouldn't be any different for babies that have yet to be born. Arguably, since they're innocent, isn't it more important we even protect their rights? Because they don't really have someone to speak for them, except for those of us that realize what we're truly talking about here. An innocent life with a heartbeat that will become a life outside of the womb and walk amongst the rest of us humans with dignity, with passion, with ideas, with dreams. That's what we're defending here. So it really mystifies me how legislation like this is so difficult to move through this body, the Senate, the Congress as a whole, or state legislatures, other types of bills we've tried in order to preserve life, to preserve the value of life. Indeed, if we're not a country that's not going to value life in all of its human forms, then really what are we? Our founders placed a great value on those liberties that have formed this country. Indeed, right above the dais, in God we trust. I think God watches us on what we do here. And He's watching for what's happening with these babies. And He wants us to tell the truth and know the truth and be able to project that truth on what is really going on with a pregnancy for those that are contemplating a very serious decision. This bill will go a long ways towards shedding the light on a quantifiable moment when there's a detected heartbeat that anybody around that ultrasound can hear. That should be a reality moment. And I think more times than not, that prospective mother will make a decision for life, given that. So I commend my colleague, Mr. King, for battling for this, for those that have lost their lives so many millions of times in the past and had nobody to defend them. But the momentum with which you're building on this legislation, on this effort, with so many pro-life groups around this country, so many pro-life legislators that are on board with this, we need a couple more of these national groups to get involved and not see fog, but instead see the clear path that this is. So I implore people to contact your legislators and contact the organizations that are supposed to be standing for life and make sure they get on board with this effort, because the heartbeat is a true indication of life. And thank you, Mr. King, for your effort with this.
And reclaiming my time and thanking the gentleman from California. He gives me a little too much credit and doesn't take enough credit for himself. That's that measure of humility I was asked about earlier today, and I would quote Trent Franks. He always said, funny thing about humility, about the time you think you've achieved it, you've lost it. And Mr. LaMalfa is a solid principled conservative, and I appreciate him coming to the floor to defend life. And the effort that we've had is the whip team that's gone out and pulled together 170 co-sponsors on this bill has helped set the stage for a path that I believe soon will be to the floor of the House of Representatives. And let's put the heartbeat bill over on Mitch McConnell's desk. That's a good place for a lot of good things to have a chance to happen, even though they're a little slower moving over there than we are over here. And one of the nimble folks that has been actively engaged in the pro-life movement in the House of Representatives is Mr. Lamborn of Colorado. And I'd be happy to yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from Colorado, Doug Lamborn.
Well, thank you, Congressman King, and I want to recognize and appreciate you for your endless and tireless leadership in reminding us of the humanity of the unborn. And I am a proud co-sponsor of the Heartbeat Protection Act. I'm one of those 170 who have stepped forward to support this much-needed piece of legislation. You know, the development of an unborn baby is truly miraculous. Around 6 to 8 weeks, you can detect through ultrasound the heartbeat of the little child inside the mother's womb. 6 to 8 weeks. So I don't see how people can deny that an abortion is the taking of a human life. So how many lives would we save if we remembered that simple fact? What if instead of rushing to abortion, which some people think is their only option, we instead turned our attention to addressing practical needs? The needs of a woman facing a pregnancy decision. What if we empowered women to carry and raise their child? Or what if we did everything we could to promote a stable and happy life for the child through adoption? America was built on the principle that life is a God-given gift, and here in Congress, it is our duty to protect human life at all stages. And I will continue to do so. I know, Representative King, you will continue to do so. I thank you for your leadership. I'm glad that I can support you with this wonderful piece of legislation. And I yield back.
The gentleman returns his time, and in reclaiming it, I thank the gentleman from Colorado for coming to the floor to make such a strong message here on the sanctity of human life. And when I think about that heartbeat, a heartbeat is a certain indicator of life. That if the baby has a beating heart, we know that that baby is alive. And that statistically speaking, that 95% or more of those little babies that have a beating heart that can be detected by an ultrasound in that 6 to 8 week period of time, 95% of them will experience a successful birth. And so I've asked the question to those who weren't supportive of the bill, did you ever hear the expression, let's err on the side of life? Well, let's not err with life at all if we can help it, but if we have a 95% chance of a successful birth, we can't take a chance on ending that little baby's life. And Mr. Speaker, this bill is a bill that's come together over the last year and a half or so. And just to mention some of the points here that I think are important, that we have at least 162 pro-life organizations and leaders that support the heartbeat bill. I have a little demonstration here. These are some of the organizations and leaders that support the heartbeat bill. We have to really search pretty hard to find somebody that's not on board. So you can go down through this list. I could read these all off, but I think it would be a little bit tiresome and maybe a little redundant. But I put these together as maybe a third of, or maybe even a fourth of, the overall list of 162 pro-life organizations and leaders that support the heartbeat bill. It's nearly universal across this country. And, of course, we don't have Planned Parenthood on here, and we don't have the NARAL here, the National Abortion Rights Action League, is what they used to be, and they say they're not anymore, but yes, they are. No, we have the pro-life organizations here, the people that care about life, the people that understand that human life is sacred in all of its forms, and it begins at the moment of conception, and that we have to protect life from that time on. We have a constitutional duty to do so. We have an equal protection clause in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution that tells us that. But it seems as though United States Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton upset that. And they decided that a right to privacy, which was a manufactured right, I don't think I have it in my memos, but it's Griswold versus Connecticut back in the 60s, this decision that a couple had a right to privacy in order to buy birth control pills. It was in Connecticut in that period of time. Shortly after that decision, they decided it wasn't just a married couple that had their right to privacy. It was an unmarried couple that had their right to privacy in the form of contraceptives. And that was only in the mid-60s. And then Roe versus Wade came along, and I think that this court can never be defended for the decision that they made, the idea that privacy trumps life, and that the privacy of a mother will allow for an abortion at any stage, is how this all came together between Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton. But even some of our professors that you might think had been the other side of the issue had their skepticism. In fact, there's a bit of it here in Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a statement that she made in 1985. She said, our Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg, Roe, meaning Roe versus Wade, Roe, I believe, would have been more acceptable as a judicial decision if it had not gone beyond a ruling on the extreme statute before the court. Heavy-handed judicial intervention was difficult to justify and appears to have provoked, not resolved, the conflict. Close quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And then I would restate the 14th Amendment, and it says this: no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So, this comes back to personhood. I believe that a conceived baby from that moment is a person. But we don't have the technical medical ability to define that moment at this point, Mr. Speaker, but we can define heartbeat, and we've done so in the Heartbeat Protection Act. And I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfus, who has been a leader and a fighter for life since back in the 80s or so when I was still in the crib. Mr. Rothfus, how much time as he may consume, providing it remains. And we do have about 9 minutes left.
I thank the gentleman for leading this special order. And may I ask how much time we have still?
About 9 minutes.
9 minutes, great. I'm not going to take 9 minutes, but I'd like to commend you for your work on the Heartbeat Protection Act. And it gives us an opportunity to reflect on some of those bigger issues that we have going on in our society. And this is personal to everybody. We all have our own stories of when we're in a family situation and somebody becomes pregnant. And, you know, I certainly remember that when my wife and I had our first child. And the first visit to the doctor, when you got to hear the heartbeat, was just amazing. And I remember also having a subsequent appointment where the doctor couldn't find the heartbeat. And we were very concerned, very worried. So they sent us to the hospital. They wanted us to have another test, and the hospital, it's a small town we were in, the hospital was where they had the sonogram. And so my wife and I were praying all the way, please let this baby be okay. Well, we got to the hospital, and the technician did a sonogram, and lo and behold, we saw the baby, we saw the beating heart. And we were just in awe at this new human life. You know, mothers and fathers are forever changed when they first hear that heartbeat. That tiny pulse that reinforces the big and beautiful reality of a precious human life. Mr. Speaker, that's why I rise in support of H.R. 490, the Heartbeat Protection Act. As a lawmaker, I took an oath to our Constitution to protect the constitutional rights of all Americans. That's why I'm co-sponsoring this bill. This legislation protects a preborn baby's life when his or her heartbeat is detected. And a heartbeat is a very basic sign of life. The pulse represents a unique person with inherent dignity and natural, human, and constitutional rights that extend throughout the continuum of life from conception until natural death. And where do these rights come from? The founders who signed the Declaration knew, for the Declaration itself says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. It's just interesting, Mr. Speaker, because the first inalienable right that's identified is the right to life. You know who else knew? It's President Kennedy. President Kennedy reminded us in a different context, in the struggle against atheistic totalitarian communism, he said these words: the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. The right to life, defined in our Declaration, protected in our Constitution, and reiterated time and again by leaders across the religious and political spectrum, applies to every human life. And it's easy to see who's human if you look. 26 years ago, the late Governor Bob Casey of Pennsylvania and others, including Sergeant Shriver and Eunice Kennedy Shriver, signed onto a statement regarding abortion as true today as when it was published. Under the section of that document that was titled, "Without a Doubt a Human Life," Governor Casey and his co-authors observed, from the beginning, each human embryo has its own unique genetic identity. 3.5 weeks after conception, its heart starts beating. At 6 weeks, brain activity can be detected. At the end of 2 months, the limbs, fingers, toes are complete. By 3 months, the baby is quite active, forming fists, bending arms, and curling toes. At 4 months, vocal cords, eyelashes, teeth buds, fingernails, and toenails are all present. By 5 months, the baby is sucking its thumb, punching, kicking, and going through the motions of crying. By 6 months, it responds to light and sound and can recognize its mother's voice. Advocates of unrestricted abortion, the statement went on, do not want the public to focus on these undeniable facts of fetal development. But the facts cannot be ignored. They make plain that abortion is a violent act, not against potential life, but against a living, growing human being, a life with potential. Governor Casey subscribed to that belief. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. Intentionally stopping a heartbeat is not health care. H.R. 490 recognizes what science has already affirmed, that there is a baby growing in her mother's womb, one with her own distinct heartbeat. Therefore, we have an obligation to protect the most vulnerable among us, to defend the defenseless. How can our country continue to flourish and claim itself as a champion of human rights when we allow our society to rid ourselves of our own future generations? That is why I came to the floor today to urge support for the Heartbeat Protection Act, to give our country a chance to reflect on some of the deeper questions and deeper values, to walk in solidarity with one another when one encounters a difficult situation, to stand in each other's shoes with empathy. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. And I again thank the gentleman from Iowa, and I yield back my time.
Reclaim my time, and I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania for his eloquent words. And I hadn't heard the description delivered by Governor Casey in those years back, but Governor Bob Casey, God rest his soul, captured my attention years ago, 20 or more years ago, and I had a quote that I had on my bulletin board that I don't have to look it up anymore. It was this, from Governor Bob Casey, Democrat. Human life cannot be measured. It is the measure itself against which all other things are weighed. And his words echo in this chamber today. I wish they echoed in his son over in the Senate the same way they echoed out of the mouth of Governor Bob Casey back in those days when he was denied the opportunity to speak before the Democrat National Convention because he's pro-life. And we look today and we see this issue has been more and more polarized. And I hope that we can be more broad with this and that we can be more bipartisan than we are. But we do have bipartisan co-sponsorship on this bill. It's narrow, but it exists. And I urge, Mr. Speaker, this body to take this bill to the floor. 170 co-sponsors is further ahead than any comparable piece of pro-life legislation. When to have that many co-sponsors and a good number of other members that have said, I'm not ready to sign on the dotted line, but you bring it to the floor and I'll vote yes. I think we get to yes, but we need to bring it here. And there's concerns that, well, if we pass it off the floor of the House, the Senate won't take it up. Well, we know they won't take it up if we don't pass it off the floor of the House. There's concern about the Supreme Court. Of course there is. We have to challenge the court. We're going to live with 1 million abortions a year in this country until we're willing to challenge the court and do so successfully. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that we're going to see 1 or 2 more appointments to this court in the next 2 or 3 or more years. And we need to get the bill off the floor onto the desk of Leader McConnell so it has a chance then to go to the President's desk, where I'm very confident that President Trump will sign the bill, and that then it has a chance to go. I'm happy with it out being litigated, but we expect it will be litigated like every other effective piece of pro-life legislation. So I appreciate the attention tonight, Mr. Speaker, the speakers that have come to the floor to weigh in for innocent unborn human life and to lay out the path for the future that we have to follow here if we're to answer to God and country for that gift from God, which is life in the first priority, then liberty, then the pursuit of happiness. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.